Okay, so the way this is going to work, I'm going to give you folks the microphone, okay, so you can pass it back and forth. You folks start with questions, comments, whatever for the speakers, and then we'll just kind of evolve from there, and then we'll wrap up. I'll come into the audience with a wireless microphone, and we'll have additional questions and comments. Sound good? We're all good? Okay.
All right, what do you guys envision with the Trump factor? Quick, easy question, but which direction do you think he's going to go? What do you think it's going to lead to? Have you heard anything about how things are going so far, although it's just barely started?
Well, it's really hard to know the future, and especially hard to know the future with Mr. Trump. The little that I know is sort of what I said in here is the two things he's really emphasized consistently is build a wall and deport the unauthorized foreigners. And whenever that has been modified, it's, well, maybe a fence would be okay in some places instead of a wall. And now, just yesterday, it's, well, we're going to target the criminals among the unauthorized. And as I said, that's somewhere, depending on how you count, 2 or 2.5 million. And that leaves open then, what about the other people? So I think there's no doubt but that there will be more effort on enforcement. The real question for agriculture would be, will there be mandatory e-verify, for example? It's already required of federal contractors and in some states. And will there be workplace raids? Remember, under President George W. Bush, we had a lot of workplace raids. So there's a whole lot of questions about what enforcement means. But the wall and enforcement were the two principles. And at this point, until somebody is appointed Secretary of Department of Homeland Security, I mean, I think I think there's undoubtedly going to be more effort at the border and undoubtedly more effort at interior enforcement. But I don't think anyone yet knows exactly what shape that's going to take.
Obviously, my work is focused more on what's happening on the Mexican side. So I guess I would just emphasize again that even as we look at what's happening on the border, as border enforcement we expect will probably rise, that doesn't mean that there's more farm workers coming to the United States or fewer farm workers. We're already looking at this overall downward trend in farm labor force. So really looking at a further future than just what's going to happen under Trump's policy.
First of all, I'd like to commend both of you. I mean, there's a lot of information up there that you both put up that I was not aware of, and it really means a lot. So, but one of the things I think that we need to look at is, as we evolve and more into a mechanized situation, which is imperative in our business, in the row crop business, is pride of ownership, pride of work. I think if you look at a lot of our workers, I mean, I was born and raised in the farming industry. I've seen 60 plus years of the Braceros. I was involved in the Bracero program. And I saw, what happened. They came and they worked and they went back home. I think what we're looking for now, we're going to be looking for in the future is people taking pride in their work. They're not seeing that pride by just bending over and cutting lettuce or cutting celery. I think when you give them the ability to work on a piece of equipment that it's kind of a job that they'd be proud of. If you can pencil that into your thoughts in the future, I think you're going to see more of those engineers, 113,000 of them, for crying out loud. That's a lot in Mexico. We're going to start seeing some of those coming here instead of having to bring them from Silicon Valley. We'll bring them from Mexico and we'll help develop this equipment. What are your thoughts on that pride of job moving into the future?
Well, once again, it's hard to say, exactly what motivates any individual worker to do a great job. But at the end of the Bracero program, there were some groups of employers that formed associations and brought in managers. I mean, in the case of Coastal Growers in Ventura County, they brought in a guy who had been managing Spanish-speaking workers in Peru to run it as a professional association. They gave Davis all their records, and the takeaway message really was that under the Bracero program in that particular county, labor management was very slack. The workers were there to work. You didn't plan ahead. If you needed them, you called them out. If you didn't call them out. What that guy did was reduce the workforce, raise the productivity, and raise the earnings enormously. And when you look at what he did, none of it is publishable really in academic journals, but he ran raffles every 2 weeks or something for the workers who showed up every day. The idea was praise in public, criticize in private, the whole military thing. But the idea that you're an exemplary worker and you're recognized in front of your peers made a huge difference. Back in the day before the internet, they gave a letter to every worker, individualized, thanking them for their service that season and inviting them, to come back the next year, et cetera. I mean, a lot of really, you could sort of say these are logical and common sense kinds of things, but they weren't done before. And therefore, before this professional manager came in, it was just the assumption that, well, we got through this season and we'll wait till next season and we'll hope people show up the way they did before. I mean, this idea of individually recognizing people in today's age when most people have cell phones and all that sort of thing, it'd be much easier to do. I don't know how much of it is done. Maybe it's done routinely and I just don't know about it. But there was a period in which that happened, and now I think going forward, a future workforce of fewer, better educated, better paid workers. I mean, it's really the old idea that if people are the most important resource, you're going to have to treat them that way. And I do think there's a lot of truth to this idea that we may, I don't know if I'll live to see it, but we may move from a mentality of I need 2 more crews to I need, Jose and Francisco, and I mean, from crews to individuals. I don't know if that will happen or not, but clearly it's happening in some cases. And I suspect that with fewer and better educated and stuff, we'll find more of that.
Sure, and that was talked a lot about the management of workers, which I think will be an important factor. As you were talking about these engineers coming from Mexico, and some of the further research that I've been looking at was really identifying the impact of constructing a secondary school in rural Mexico on the probability that kids in that village will grow up to work in agriculture. And not surprisingly, when you construct a secondary school in a village, the kids in those villages are much less likely to work in agriculture when they get to be working age. And so once again, I think that's touching on some of the same things you mentioned, but thinking about those skills, as kids get educated, if you think even about your own education, you learn certain skills and then you think about how to employ those in the workforce and where you can actually receive benefits from your education and your skills. So thinking about what that new generation looks like, what skills do they have, how do they want to employ those skills, and how can they be rewarded for the education that they have, and thinking about what these jobs might look like and how we can complement those skills.
Well, I guess I'll say a few things. One, to summarize, we have been able to, work to try to retain our workers. Where 15 years ago we had the ability to bring in people in and out. We, generally paid more than our counterparts in row crops on either a daily wage related to piece rate or just an hourly wage. So our need was simply filled on a weekly basis. That has absolutely changed these days, and so we're using fewer people, longer days, full weeks. When times slowed down back then, we cut hours and had our key people stay around. Now we have more people working longer hours, and so we've had to make those management adjustments. I think it's key that we're trying to train our people better. We're trying to get them to be part of the company. Of course, we don't want them to exit and go to other vineyards or to other row crops and try to have them balance that. We don't have the ability to pay more than our row crop, competitors for that labor. In many cases, those row crops are paying more. We see our workers staying with us in the vineyard business because of that, stooping versus not stooping work. We're seeing that change, of course, with hoop houses and raspberries and blackberries and those sort of things, where as those have significantly increased without, we're still competing somewhat against those strawberry jobs, but those hoop houses have really changed Santa Barbara County's labor supply. So, those are kind of some of the things that we're seeing in our company, and again, it comes back to, I think, and it's been touched on, it's huge to have continued training of our people, making them part of the company versus just trying to pay them more, which is really hard to do these days.
Speaking of the Donald Trump question, I immediately talked to my boss, and he'd, because the Western growers just had their convention in Hawaii last week, and I'm sure that was one of the main topics was how are we going to deal with this? I can't remember if the convention ended, I think, before the election, but it didn't. That's right. The convention was over Wednesday, and Tuesday night we got the results. But I know that Tom Nassif is going to have a very good audience with Mike Pence and Donald Trump, and to emphasize the need to sit down and work out a streamlined H-2A program. And I think, I'm just reading between the lines on this thing, and I really don't think, I was watching football, so I couldn't watch 60 Minutes, but I did catch it on Fox and Friends this morning, that there is, I can see, just look at his eyes, and you can see him talk and listen to him. I don't think he's looking at those 11 million. I really don't think that. I think that was I don't want to use the word ploy because it's a little strong for that, but I really think he's going to target the ones that don't belong here. And I think he's going to see some leniency with the ones who have been productive members of our society, which most of our workers are. And I'm hoping he doesn't go after the ones that had a single DUI, because that would take probably most of our workers out of our workplace. But anyway, I really see that's going to happen. And it behooves the American Farm Bureau, Western Growers Association, all the big organizations are going to have to plant their butts right on the White House lawn and make sure that they carry that point that we absolutely have to have a streamlined H-2A. We can't have one that supplies us with workers 20 or 30 days after our crop is gone. So it's really, and especially for us, we need them year round because we're harvesting all the time. If it's not in the Salinas Valley, it's in Imperial Valley or Yuba. So we're constantly moving, but we need that workforce. And it's interesting to see what you're talking about as far as the move away from coming out of Mexico. And we're seeing a lot of our people came from El Salvador. Most of our workforce is from Oaxaca. And it kind of helps the stoop labor because they're usually short people. And so it's not as far to bend over, but still, they're getting tired of it. And I've seen it over the years. They cannot do this anymore. And they don't want to. They don't want to be doing the stoop labor. So it behooves us in the ag industry to develop our own equipment to make sure that we have that ability to remove the stoop labor, put the product up on moving platforms, or send it to a shed. The reason we quit moving product to sheds is because of solid waste that was generated in the city of Salinas, which cost a fortune to get rid of, and the labor was higher in the shed. That's not the case anymore. Solid waste, they're tripping over each other to get that to make compost with. And the labor in the field is going to be the same as it is in the shed now. So really, get the product up, get it into a shed where people can work under cover, out of the weather, not have to bend over. People don't mind doing that. They just don't want to be stooping over harvesting these crops anymore. That's what I've seen.
Yeah, I was going to say just trying to stretch the amount of labor that we do have. I know I try to get the crews and build them up kind of end of August before harvest, especially. and just try to keep them very busy, because I know that if I don't, they will be lost to somewhere else and I will not get them back. So that becomes more and more difficult every year, and it becomes a little tighter and a little tighter. As a company with Mesa Vineyard Management, we do more than 2,000 acres of just basically strictly mechanical everything, which 10 years ago was not the case. It was mostly machine harvesting, and now it's beyond that to machine pruning, machine shoot thinning, machine everything you can think of. And over time, it's really helped to learn how to do that. But at the same time, you have to have a willing winery that wants to purchase those grapes. Otherwise, you're not doing it for really any reason at all, because you need a winery that's going to want to buy that and process it. So we've been lucky. We've had some wineries that want to work with us on that and help be progressive, and that has helped a lot. And even this last year, these harvesters and machines that have the destemmers on them, we've been doing different trials from different kinds that we have out there, and we had one just at Pomar Junction at the winery. And this is the first year we actually just picked, and it came off cleaner, from the machine than it would have going through our sorting table and through our destemmer. And so we just basically took it straight from the vineyard and weighed it and dumped it into the tanks, because it was as clean as it could possibly be, which is really nice to see. And actually, and for production, keeping everything busy, as soon as the first 3 bins came in, because we're a small winery and use macro bins, you weigh it and you get it into the winery, and as soon as those things are weighed in the winery, the next 3 are ready to go. Compared to, we probably replaced about 45, 50 people just like that, was kind of just replaced by doing it this way. So I think constantly trying to do the mechanization has been very helpful, and kind of help push that. But on the other hand, you guys were talking about labor possibly coming from other countries like China. And so what do you think the possibilities are with something like that taking place?
Okay, let me sort of make 3 points. One is on farm labor, second on mechanization, third on H2A. First on farm labor. The world's labor force is about 3.5 billion people. So roughly the world's population is a little over 7 billion. And in pretty much all countries, you take the population, divide by 2, that's the labor force. So we're 315 million people, and our labor force is 155 million. World is the same. The biggest single sector of employment in the world is agriculture. Right? A little over 1 billion people employed in agriculture. As Diane emphasized, people are getting out of agriculture everywhere, whether it's in China or India or Mexico. But there are still a lot of people employed in agriculture. And Mexico's not the only country that is sending workers to work in agriculture in one country and importing workers from another country. For example, Thailand. Thais go to work in Israel in agriculture, and Thailand imports Burmese to work in its own agriculture. The same is true in Poland. Poles go to Spain to pick strawberries. The Poles bring in Ukrainians to pick their apples. So this is not a new phenomenon. It's everywhere. And in the world as a whole, there are a lot of people who would be willing to come and work in U.S. agriculture for $10 an hour or $15 an hour, whatever. They may not have the same crops. It may take several years. But I always use the example of hand-cutting sugarcane in Florida. Because the Jamaicans primarily did it with H-2A visas. They cut an average of 1.5 tons of cane an hour. In Jamaica, the average productivity was about 0.5 ton of cane an hour. What happened? You were selecting the very best cane cutters from Jamaica to work in Florida because of the wage differential. And I suspect that if we were to go to a 3-year visa, you may have a different model. Right now, the model is often individual growers using buses to bring workers from Mexico. You could have a model which is like the Middle Eastern model. People get on airplanes to go. Even farm workers get on airplanes to go from one country to another. They stay longer, typically 2 or 3 years, but it changes the whole economics of the importing labor. I don't know if we'll get there. That goes to the H-2A program. The H-2A program has 3 requirements: try to recruit U.S. workers, provide free and approved housing, and pay the adverse effect wage rate. And lots of other ones, but those are the three main ones. It's almost impossible to begin as an H2A grower without being sued, because you're likely to have violated one of very many rules. But once an employer is in the program for 5 or 6 years, or 3 or 4, depending, usually, if the workers are returning, the productivity is reasonably high. And what I worked for the Office of Foreign Labor Certification. DOL is not as much the problem as the high fees at the USCIS, Citizenship and Immigration Services, and then the high fees at Department of State, especially when the Department of State computers break down and they issue no visas anywhere for a few weeks until they get their visa things fixed again. But if we were to revise H2A, I already mentioned the 3-year visa, the other thing that I think we may move toward is an ABC rating concept for employers. It's having sat with the people in Chicago who do the certification, they know when an application comes in from Western Range for sheep herders, it's pretty clean. You have to proof it, it'll take 10 minutes. But some of you might remember Global Horizons, which was an Israeli-American kicked out of Israel for basically charging workers, Thai workers, $5,000 for their jobs, set up in Beverly Hills, charged Thai workers $5,000 for jobs, mostly took them to Washington. The growers who used Global Horizons to get workers paid for the Thai workers who were in their first year and didn't pick very fast, then also had to pay for the US workers who were not hired because Beverly Hills, or the Global Horizons told them to show up where there was no work, and had to pay legal fees on top of it. So it's going to take a while to sort out the good and the bad in H2A, and unfortunately there are a lot of less than good. I recommended that DOL take what's now an informal rating system and formalize it. If you're a fixed situs employer, that is, you've got land and buildings and assets, you don't have complaints, you're basically self-certified. You still have a housing issue, and you still have a wage issue, but you don't have to worry about DOL. If you're first time in the program, but there are, believe it or not, a lot of very shady characters in the H2A program. And if 10,000 people now are applying for H2A every year, and I'd like to say they're all great, but they're not. And unfortunately, the way they have to work is they have to treat everybody as guilty until they're innocent, and that's a process that may have to change. And finally, on mechanization, back when UC was sued, it was more or less a political suit in which UC won, but they technically won, but they really lost. Remember what the basic idea was. They needed to have engineers that would get the tomatoes to more or less plant scientists to get the tomatoes to ripen more or less uniformly, and then a machine for a once-over harvest, so you didn't multiple pick. And so you needed the scientists working with the engineers, but what really made the mechanization happen over a 5-year period, and it's important to remember, we grow between 5 and 6 times more processing tomatoes now than we did in the early 1960s. What made it happen was, of course, the science and the engineering, but it was the random sampling stations, because before you had 60 processed tomatoes are $1.50 or 2 cents a pound, you had 60-pound lugs, guy puts them